Welcome, this is another David the Real Met White video, and before I even begin with this topic, Classical Atheist, my love, my dear, if you're watching this, I would first like to bring to you something that you might want to see. As some of you might know, Orto Brosnick has issued a challenge to a debate towards Classical Atheist. And he's doing the classical, ignore move, but I will really like to see this debate. If there's going to be a papacy debate, I think this will be a very good one. Instead of just insulting each other, I think it will be the best to see a papacy debate. I just want to start with that. But, the character in question is going to be pretty relevant here. And this is going to be dealing with the question of, can the Eucharist transmit disease, right? And the reason why I'm making such a video is because on Twitter and perhaps in other platforms as well, there is this kind of heated debate on whether the Eucharist can transmit disease. Now, what are the positions? Which church holds which position? The Orthodox Christians, very so, hold the position that the Eucharist cannot transmit disease, right? So you will not get coronavirus. I can't speak today, but you will not get coronavirus through the Eucharist, says the Orthodox Church, whereas many Roman Catholics say the opposite. You can transmit disease from the Eucharist. So the body and blood of Christ somehow transmits disease, and this is something I want to make note of. I think this is very interesting. I think this is something that we have to talk about. But it seems very weird to me that Roman Catholics seem very adamant on the Eucharist when they're debating non-sacramentalist Protestants that deny that the Eucharist is a real presence. Right? They make fun of those people, but then they turn around and say that the Eucharist can transmit disease. Really? It can transmit disease? That the question itself, for most of you people who are sane and actually have proper faith, for you this is a ludicrous question, right? Of course you can't get sickness, but in this video we're going to be condescending to the level of the Roman Catholic and see why and how they come to this conclusion. Now, one argument that Classical Atheists gave that I want to tackle, and I think this isn't about being right or wrong necessarily, but this is about avoiding dangerous theological presuppositions. If we accept these theological presuppositions, then we can end up in huge danger, and we don't want to be in that danger. So this is an example of this. A friend of mine, Patriarch Prime on Twitter, he didn't ask, but he stated that Christ's body and blood cannot transmit a disease to you, which is sane. I mean, this is the correct position. And then he says, why not? What's the causal connection? The Eucharist is spiritual food for the journey, not necessarily tended toward physical satiation. So here we are seeing this separation between the physical and the spiritual. Make note of this, because this is the key error that Classical Atheist makes. That's why Christ contrasts it against the manna of Moses. It's spiritual food for spiritual purpose, the bread of life. So again, we see this separation of the physical with the spiritual when both are real. Now, in terms of the Eucharist, so he's basically, again, he's making Eucharist into this purely spiritual thing. Let's look at Saint Cyril of Alexandria. We have two quotes from Saint Cyril of Alexandria, and this book is, let me take a look once more. It is The Theology of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, Critical Appreciation by Thomas Weinandy. And so St. Cyril says that the Eucharist dispels both death and the diseases that are in us. So the Eucharist dispels death and disease. So how can something that dispels death and disease cause death and disease? Now, there is actually indeed a way, but we will get to that very much later. And as a matter of fact, the only way that it can bring death or disease is not coronavirus. It's not through a virus. And what's another part that is very important to understand is that St. Kirill says that the appropriation of divine life is twofold. This is from the same book, page 73, both physical and spiritual. For a double healing is required. So notice how the Nestorian classical atheist, and this is really the Nestorian position, I will explain later on why, but the Nestorian atheist here separates the physical from the spiritual, whereas St. Kirill insists on a double healing, right? That the divine life is twofold and that the healing is both physical and spiritual. So the Eucharist heals us spiritually, but also physically. And lastly, I will be citing Jean-Joseph Gaume. Now, you might not know who he is. He's a Roman Catholic French theologian. He cites Saint Cyril of Alexandria, who says the Holy Eucharist dispels diseases and heals the sick. So he uses this exact quotation. And then he cites Saint Gregory of Nazianzus about how his father was cured by receiving the Eucharist. So there is a physical and spiritual aspect to the Eucharist, not merely a spiritual aspect to the Eucharist. And why is this Nestorian? Because the Eucharist, the doctrine of the Eucharist, is connected to Christology, right? It's a Christological thing as well. And the best evidence for that is if you look back at St. Kirill against Nestorius, one of the arguments that St. Kirill used against Nestorius is the Eucharist. He asks Nestorius, how is it possible for us to eat the flesh and blood of Christ? If the divine logos merely assumed a human person, then aren't we just eating a human person's flesh and blood instead of eating the flesh and blood of God? Exactly. So Christology and Eucharistic theology are both connected, and obviously they're connected because they're dealing with Christ. Right? So there is this connection. Denying this connection is nonsensical. And to separate these things, separating the physical from the spiritual of the Eucharist is like Nestorius, where he separates the physical nature of Christ from his spiritual divine nature. So there's a separation of these two natures. And this is sacramental Nestorianism. This is incredibly dangerous. We cannot accept this. And on the topic, I kind of forgot to mention this, but on the topic of whether we should attend church. Now, that's a different debate, right? This debate is not necessarily on whether we should go to church or not. So there are certain parishes, including Orthodox parishes, that actually did stop church services. I don't personally agree, but I'm not going to attack them on that. The same goes for Roman Catholics. That's not really the problem. The problem is this notion that you can contract disease from the Eucharist. That is blasphemous. That is what we're attacking. So this is what we have in focus. But on the topic of what should we be doing in the times of disease, we can look at the life of Saint Dionysius the Great, who is the Pope of Alexandria. He lived in the 3rd century, and he has sent a letter. And I will not read the letter, but I will be posting this in the description below so you can look it out for yourself. But what is very interesting is that at the times where Lent is being approached, and it was a time of plagues, right, massive plagues, kind of like what is going on today, he says that the Christians continued to do celebrations. We continued to anticipate Lent and do celebrations with people outside without fearing plagues. We did not fear plagues. We still celebrated Christ. We still went to church. And we still lived the life of Christ. And what the pagans did is the opposite. The pagans panicked and they ran away. And so if you watch Father Josiah Trenham's latest video on this topic, he will say the same thing. Right? So Saint Dionysius, the Pope of Alexandria, also says the same thing. This is very important to note because I think this is something that we can learn. And if we again notice, the Orthodox Church on a wide scale, right, there are some churches that are closing, but on a wide scale, you see that the Orthodox churches still operate. They don't really mind coronavirus. They're not really scared of coronavirus. I can testify to that. We just had liturgy Sunday, and we had Vespers on Sunday, so I can attest to that myself. We don't really have any fear of coronavirus. We are still willing to do liturgy. I'm not trying to make an argument that, because we still do liturgy during coronavirus, we're better. That's not really the argument I'm trying to make. It is, what I'm just saying is that the fathers thousands of years ago did what we are doing today. So the ultimate question that I want to get to, I mean, I spent 10 minutes of your time and I still haven't really answered this question yet. Can the Eucharist transmit disease? Yes, it can. And no, it cannot. So let's focus on the yes, it can. And this is the argument that I was kind of talking about earlier on. It can indeed transmit disease, but in what way? So if you remember Christ in his earthly life, Christ's humanity is incorruptible, right? So Psalm 16:10 points that out. But he at the same time condescended, where he willed to be under blameless passions. So what are those blameless passions? Well, eating will be one of them. So he willed to hunger, as an example. He is not, even in his humanity, he should not be hungry because he has a prelapsarian human nature, but he willed to be hungry. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that if you're the virus is a result of corruption, and the virus is around the body of Christ. Whether you're trying to argue that, well, it's not a part of the body of Christ, I think it's completely irrelevant to the discussion. If God wills it, if Christ wills it, he can make his flesh and blood a sickness to you in order to heal you from a spiritual ailment, right? So this happens numerous times. Someone that very unworthily takes the Eucharist does sometimes end up being sick, and it ends up being a lesson for them. And so that sickness actually heals them, both physically even, but also spiritually. But for the key to this is that Christ has to will this. And so what this becomes is that this becomes independent of any epidemics that are going around in the world. So Christ has to will it in his human nature to say, yes, my body and my blood is going to be a sickness to you, right? Because the Eucharist is truly his flesh and blood. So no, it cannot transmit disease because his real humanity we are partaking of is incorruptible, right? And if you're going to argue, so certain Roman Catholics are going to say, well, you don't really understand transubstantiation, dude. Like, okay, the substance of the bread and wine, they become the body and blood, but the accidents remain, and the sickness spreads through the accident. But to me, that really seems like them just rationalizing. I think the principle of God having to will that still very much applies. So even whatever you take, if you take the body and blood of Christ alongside with that, he has to willingly. He doesn't only permitting it does not do justice. He has to will it for you to be sick of disease. But as I mentioned before, this is independent of whether there's any sickness going around in the first place, right? And what's really funny about this that I want to add is that, I mean, aren't you eating the real body and blood of Christ? Doesn't a body contain germs? So you're going to contract germs either way when you're eating the body and blood of Christ. And so if you're going to say that, oh, we can't take the Eucharist because coronavirus, well, the problem is you can apply to that to everything. Even normal diseases like the flu, you can apply to it and say, oh, we should avoid the Eucharist overall because, Christ has a human body, right? So he has, he can transmit disease because it's a human body that we're eating, right? I mean, it's stupid, it's nonsensical, I get it. But that is the logical conclusion of this nonsense in question. And so we as Orthodox will reject this. And someone asked, why am I even talking about all this stuff? It's really obvious, but again, I'm condescending to the level of supposed scholastic arguments to show, even in their own grounds, what they're saying is completely heretical. To imply that we can transmit disease from the Eucharist implies there's two different scenarios. There's either Christ wills the disease to affect you, in which then, because the operation is his will, it doesn't matter what sickness or disease it is, right? So that any pandemic or epidemic doesn't matter in the question. Or Christ can unwillingly, right? He doesn't will it, but he still nevertheless transmits disease. The obvious problem with that is that means he unwillingly transmits disease. That means his humanity is corruptible, unwillingly corruptible. So he doesn't really have a prelapsarian human nature. So Christ's humanity is fallen. That is heretical. We can't accept this position. And this is what's really important, is that all of this has a logical connection to one another. And if we don't fight against these heresies, if we don't fight against these stupid positions, stupid atheistic Jewish positions that many Roman Catholics want to promote, if we don't fight against all of this, then the logical conclusions are going to be arriving to where they are. So if we want to summarize, we look at the Church Fathers. The Eucharist heals us. What heals us cannot be the source of death unless Christ explicitly wills it to be so. But then again, that's independent of any disease that's going on. I repeated myself in that. I think I repeated that sentence like 5 times this video. Classical Atheist uses Nestorian argumentation in order to make it acceptable for him to deny sacraments. And Roman Catholics are hypocritical in the sense that they will constantly argue against Protestants about how the sacraments are real, or how the Eucharist is a real body and blood of Christ. But at the same turn, they deny it. And even worse than denying it, they say that they can transmit disease from the source of life. You can transmit evil unwillingly from God, from the source of life. That is nonsensical, and we cannot accept that. So thank you all for watching. This is the end of the video. I will see you guys in the next video. God bless you all. Thank you all for watching. And if you want to follow me on YouTube, you can subscribe to my channel. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can just click follow me on Twitter, subscribe to my Telegram. And if you want to support my work, you can always go to my Patreon and give me some of that cash, like the good Jew I am. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.